Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us in this very important webinar. I am the Hub Manager for the Northwestern Hub in Northwestern Ontario, and I'm very pleased to have two wonderful presenters joining us today to discuss Indigenous program evaluation. The goals of the webinar today are to provide participants with a better understanding of the principles and spirit of Indigenous youth program evaluation, to increase participant understanding of the needs for this Indigenous specific evaluation, and three, to offer insights on how to incorporate fully culturally meaningful and culturally relevant evaluation practices into youth work. I'd like to ask what everyone's familiarity is in terms of evaluation. And I've got a poll up here, so if you could enter if you have any familiarity with talking circles, with ceremony, with safe spaces, with community involvement, or arts-based approaches. So go ahead and fill that in. Okay, so we have a pretty high familiarity with community involvement, followed by talking circles, which is great, safe spaces, ceremony, and arts-based approaches. So that's good that we've got a pretty high level of familiarity with some, and we've got a lot to learn on others, and it's great because we have our presenters here today who are going to talk about these approaches. First up, we have Dr. John Hodson. Welcome. He is of Mohawk descent, Turtle Clan, and he's the director of the Mama Whistlewin Education Research Centre in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Dr. Hodson has worked in Aboriginal education at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary levels in Canada, as well as internationally for over 20 years. He's published widely on the subject. As the director of the Mama Whistlewin Education Centre, he provides leadership to this independent, non-aligned centre of inquiry that offers culturally appropriate teacher development programming and research services to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. And we also have Gabrielle Fayant, and she is the co-founder of the Assembly of Seven Generations, an Indigenous nonprofit youth-led organization that came together after the winter of Idle No More from the vision of three young people. A7G has successfully run an empowerment program called Reach Up North in the winter of 2015 and is now working with the mass blanket exercise movement, which will bring together 11 cities across Canada in the spring of 2016 to face the untold history of Canada through the lens of Indigenous peoples over the last 500 years. Gabrielle is also the recipient of the 2015 Inspire Métis Youth Awards and the 2016 J.S. Woodsworth Individual Leadership Award. She has also worked with the National Association of Friendship Centres, the Native Women's Association of Canada, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and the Canadian Commission of UNESCO's Youth Advisory Group. But she's done the most meaningful work in ceremony and reclaiming traditional songs and medicines that have been taken away from many Indigenous families, from residential schools and the child welfare system. At the age of 28, Gabrielle is the access producer, writer, and host of a television show called Non-Gone, meaning today, in the Anishinaabe that highlights today's realities of Indigenous peoples. And she is also the interim co-host and producer of the Michif Hour on CKCU-FM, a radio show that talks about Métis history and contemporary issues while exploring Métis artists, past and present. She also sings with a women's hand drum group called Spirit Flowers and helps facilitate a drum circle every week at the Wabano Health Center. Quite an established young woman. So please join me in welcoming these two wonderful presenters. Go ahead, John.
Bonjour. My name is John Akweniiostha Hodson. I live in Thunder Bay. I'm a Mohawk, as Carly said, but I'm also I live in Anishinaabe territory, the territory of the Ojibwe in Thunder Bay. So Thunder Bay is a huge area. The district here is somewhat the size of France. Massive land base, very remote communities, large urban communities, and I'm very involved in research in this territory and have been, as Carly said, for probably 20 years. I want to begin today by getting you to think about a simple act that we all learned at childhood. Many of you will be familiar with this element, this ball. And I want you to think back, if you would, for a moment, to when you learn to catch a simple ball as a child. And most of you, as you think back, you'll realize that you probably learned to catch a ball by the time you were 5, and that ball, the ability to catch that ball was learned over time with practice with your parents, with your siblings, with kids in the neighborhood, and that if we were together in one room and I was to throw this ball at you, you would attempt to catch it. You wouldn't think about how you would catch it. You would just respond to this projectile coming towards your head, and you would put your arms out and your hands out, and you would attempt to catch it. It's something that will always be imprinted in your brain. So you may not have caught a ball in months, in years, and yet if I threw this at you, you would attempt and probably be successful at catching it. Even if you were 90 and you hadn't caught a ball in 20 years, if I threw this at you, and if you had learned to catch, you would attempt to catch it. It would be an immediate response. It wouldn't be a thoughtful response. It would be a response at a very base level, and it's literally about the wiring in your head that happened probably before the time you were 5. And you will always carry that wiring in your head until you pass on to this next world. Now, why do I talk about this? This is a central tenet, I think, and a great example of the word epistemology. Some would call it worldview. Some would call it cosmology. I tend to call it epistemology. And epistemology is the values and beliefs of a nation, of a culture. And just like you learn to catch the ball as a child, and just as you don't really have an awareness of that ability, and just like you respond to the stimulus of a ball coming towards your head, it's the same thing, the same way that we learn our epistemologies as children. We learn our epistemologies at the feet of our parents and our grandparents. We learn it by the systems and the culture that we're involved in. It's something that's extraordinarily subtle. It's something that is wired into our heads as children, and it's something that we carry with us until we leave this earth for that spirit world. Now, okay, why do I mention epistemology? It's quite simple. In North America, in Turtle Island, as we know it, there are two epistemologies, two main epistemologies. There's an epistemology that came from Europe, some like 500 years ago, and landed in the Americas and has evolved into Western capitalism. Now there's another, or Western democratic tradition perhaps, and there's another epistemology that literally came out of the experience of Turtle Island over perhaps as long as 20,000 years of experience, and it's an indigenous epistemology. And if you were to plot these epistemologies and compare them one to another, what you would see is they are literally on an opposite spectrum from one another. Western democratic tradition is the absolute opposite from an indigenous epistemology, indigenous values and beliefs. And if you think back in terms of the history of the Americas and what has happened over time, what you soon see is what has happened. Colonization has been about the disruption of our traditional epistemology. It's through tactics of colonization, like residential schools, like the 60s scoop, like the treaty process, and some areas of the Americas, the mass slaughter of the indigenous people by violence, and in others by violence and by disease. That has totally disrupted our epistemology and our cultures, and we are regrettably the results of that in our communities today. So why do I talk about epistemology? Why do I talk about research? If I was to go around and ask each and every one of you individually, tell me about your epistemology, most of you wouldn't be able to sort of state clearly what your epistemology is. And frankly, you don't have to, because your epistemology is all around you. You are awarded, rewarded, you are stimulated, you respond to the epistemology that is the dominant society in this country, just like you respond to the ball coming towards your head unconsciously. You don't have to have a different epistemology, because everything in this country is about a dominant epistemology. Well, Aboriginal kids are the same. Aboriginal youth have the same lack of awareness of their epistemology as, and I shouldn't say that's all, it's a sweeping generalization, but generally I think it's fair to say that most kids don't have a sense of their epistemology, their values and beliefs. And what happens in school, when kids are in school, is you see a conflict that arises in classrooms between a teacher who carries that dominant epistemology and teaches through that dominant epistemology, and a child who comes into that classroom with a different epistemology, and this is what happens. Well, guess what happens to that? Who wins that conflict? And the one who wins that conflict is inevitably the teacher and or the school, and the child ends up walking out of classrooms and leaving schools in droves. And that's one of the reasons we have the problems that we have in terms of levels of dropoutism of our children. So this is just a brief overview before I get started into this. So what I'm going to present today is not only my understanding of what an Indigenous research method is, and it's my understanding, it's based on my experience, it's based on my experience of research, it's based on my discussions with elders and traditional people and faith keepers, and it's my understanding based on the analysis of my own experience, especially my analysis when I did a postdoctorate in New Zealand in 2009, where I worked with Maori people and in an extensive school research project called Teiko Tekitanga. So I'm going to show, by the way, before I begin this presentation, I want to make sure that you recognize that I'm not an expert in this technology, so there may be some lags. I regret that, and I apologize in advance. But also, I want you to know that my intent is not to offend anyone, or to leave anyone out. Again, my understanding is my understanding. It may not be yours, and I present it in a humble and respectful way for your consideration. So, shall we begin? So I see that I'm showing this screen. I believe that a book chapter that I published with a group of Maori and non-Maori educators and scholars was available to those of you who in advance of this webinar. But so I broke this down into what I know about indigenous culturally responsive method of relations. Again, the epistemology of Indigenous people and the epistemology of non-Indigenous people are at different ends of the spectrum. Our epistemology is our epistemology. It's worked for us for 20,000 years, give or take, and it has worked for us and continues to work for us. So when I talk about these things, recognize that I'm going to show you and speak to things that are really on the other, perhaps are on the other end of the spectrum from, I've always got trouble with cameras, the other end of the spectrum from what your experience is. So this is my experience. So it may clash with your experience, and it may upset you, and I regret that, but it is my experience. All right, so what I know about this culturally responsive method of relations is that it's a spiritual and emotional and an intellectual as well as a physical experience, and that's defined by our relationship with the land, the people of the land, and with ourselves. Just that one statement flies in the face of the dominant understanding of how research is done. Researchers, for the most part, parachute themselves into situations, connecting and building relationships. And when I speak of with the land, I live in the far north of Ontario, not the far north, but far enough north, where the land and the wild land is literally 10 minutes outside of town. Yesterday I spent the entire day, myself and my wife in our canoe on the Akweniiostha River, canoeing and fishing, and as part of our response to the National Aboriginal Day, which was to get back to the land and get back to the waters and sort of renew ourselves, continue the building of that relationship with the land. The land, in my estimation, doesn't necessarily limit ourselves to just the wild land. I can recall conversations I had with traditional people, clan mothers, faith keepers in Six Nations in southwestern Ontario, and their situation is very different from the situation in the Northwest and Ojibwe people and Métis people. And their position is, you know what? It's all our land. Our land doesn't end at the limits of, Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. It's all our land. So our land could be in the middle of a city, in an urban center, in a downtown situation, but it's still our land. And we need to get attached to that land and understand what's going on with the people that inhabit that land and through that process with ourselves. In these contexts, we can expect confirmations and guidance from the spirit world. I understand research to literally be a spiritual endeavor. Um, it has to be a spiritual endeavor because what we're really engaging with is our ancestors and with the power of the spirit world. Tobacco within, whether it's the Haudenosaunee or the Anishinaabe or the Métis tradition and on this territory, is a spiritual medicine that we engage this and open literally the assistance of the spiritual world with. So tobacco plays large, and even that flies in the face with the dominant understanding of what tobacco is about in Canada and in North America. So it's a spiritual experience, and we need to treat it as that. We need to treat it respectfully. We need to treat others that we deal with respectfully, and we need to literally expect confirmations and guidance from the spirit world. Now, I've had situations where that guidance is literally books falling off shelves and books in bookstores at my feet, which I pick up and sort of discover that they're an important part of the work that I'm doing. In other instances, it's about dreams. In other instances, it's about people who come to us that we don't expect that play a role. In other instances, it's about a piece of literature, a journal article, or something to that effect that helps inform us. And I take these as confirmations and that from the spirit world that are providing guidance with us because we began the work from a spiritual perspective. We must reject the notion of objectivity and embrace our subjectivity. There is no such thing as objectivity in Native cultures. In other words, it's from my perspective, it is a myth propagated by the dominant society that we sort of invest ourselves in as scholars, as researchers, that really doesn't exist. I mean, someone tell me, please tell me, show me, demonstrate to me how you can get outside of your own experience in the work that you do. I don't care if you're an anthropologist. I don't care if you're working with youth populations or adult populations. There's no way that you can divorce yourself from what's going on around you. You are a subject of that research. You are also part of that research, and there's a duality that happens in those kinds of circumstances. So what I say is, like, let's forget about this notion of objectivity. It's a myth. It's just impossible to do. Let's really sort of admit what's going on here. We are just as much subjects of the research within an Indigenous research method as we are observers and or researchers. We've got to get rid of this myth of control. This is a dominant view of the world, that somehow we can control what happens around us. And it propagates so much of the research of the dominant community, the myth of control. There is no such thing as control. If you want to, the old saying is, if you want to make God laugh, make a plan. Just give up this notion of control and sort of go with the flow. A great example of that is Lake Superior is the third largest body of fresh water in the world. It is a massive body of water, and it is a scary body of water. And if you've ever been on a canoe in it, just when it's calm, there's still a 3-foot swell, not breaking waves, but a 3-foot swell. And when you're in a small canoe, a 17 or 16-foot canoe, and you're on those waters, it is a scary experience because of that swell, just the swell, not breaking waves, just the swell. And it's like riding a roller coaster or riding a horse. You have to learn to ride it because you sure as hell can't control it. Well, research is much the same thing. You've got to learn to ride it and be part of it and not attempt to control it. The worst thing you can do is attempt to control research, and all you do in the end is tick off those that you're working with. Allow things to occur and be part of that occurrence and get rid of this notion of control. The other piece is it's very much about a pattern of deep, respectful observation, listening, and personal reflection. Teiko Tekitanga is, and was, it's now been renamed, rebranded by the government of New Zealand, was a world-renowned program that helped teachers of Maori, non-Maori teachers in New Zealand, operation for about 10 years. It was a massively successful piece of research. that was demonstrated by the increases of academic achievement of Maori kids that were in schools that had Te Ko Tekitanga programs in. The program had attracted a whole bunch of scholars from around the world who came to participate in and observe or continue their own research about why Te Ko Tekitanga worked so well. When I went there to New Zealand, I literally, all I did was for the first 6 months is carry boxes as for the women that ran Te Ko Tekitanga. For the most part, it was women. There were a few men there as well, but for the most part, the leadership was under the women, which is culturally appropriate from a Maori perspective and certainly culturally appropriate from a Haudenosaunee perspective. The greatest compliment I had was at a hui, or it's much like a circle that we have, a talking circle, where some of the women, or one of the women, the head woman of Te Ko Tekitanga introduced me and said that he's the only one that ever came here from from other areas of the world and didn't tell us how to do things. Our job isn't to tell people how to do things and what they're doing wrong. As researchers, we're about observation, listening, deep listening, and how that deep listening should trigger our reflection. Reciprocity, it's a give and take situation. I have worked with non-Indigenous researchers, professors for probably 2 decades, and the reciprocity that I've been able to cobble together is, and reciprocity, again, a traditional notion, an Indigenous notion, you give and you get, is basically how I conceptualize it. If a researcher, non-Indigenous researcher, is going to come and agrees to work with us to bring their expertise into community, that's great. What they get in return is they get an opportunity to publish within a limited sort of frame of reference. So that's reciprocity in that example. And it's a humbling experience because it's about giving and not expecting, but giving. There's always resistance to this kind of thing. And if you reflect on this notion of objectivity versus subjectivity, the myth of control, sometimes we are the resistance. Sometimes our unconscious knowing gets in the way of the work that we do. That's where the deep reflection comes in. Sometimes we are the resistance, and one must invest a lifetime of work to promote real change. Nothing occurs, in a couple of years of work. I've been doing this for 20 years, and if I was to benchmark the amount of change that I've seen, it's not huge. Let's put it that way. I think I'm turning it over to Gabrielle. Bonjour, Gabrielle. Nihi, John Hodson. It's over to you. Miigwech.
So just as John was talking about, one thing that I've always learned from elders and knowledge keepers is about communication. And so one part of that communication is letting people know that you heard them. And so that's also something that happens in those talking circles, is we're kind of constantly debriefing each other and listening to each other, and then repeating each other. I think my webcam might be turning on, but so what I wanted to say is just a little bit of a debrief of what John said, and acknowledge a lot of his points, a lot of his discussion I can definitely relate to. Even starting with the most simplistic ways of explaining how different understandings might cause a little bit of tension. So I really appreciate that ball example. It was really simple to understand, and people have this weird idea that as Indigenous people we're very complex, and it's true that we are. We're all complex, all of us. All people are very complex, but we have very simplistic values. They're very relatable values, very, very simple to understand. Oh, I think my webcam's turning on. So with that being said, I also wanted to acknowledge, that we do things a little bit differently. We do have a little bit of different understandings of how we how we experience things. And I really like that example that John used about the mental, the spiritual, the physical, and the emotional. I find as Indigenous people, you know, not to say that all Indigenous people are the same. That's definitely not true, but I often see that when I meet peers from across the country. We have this really unique way and different way of understanding what's around us and experiencing that. Um, some other points that I really liked is how John talked about letting go of control. That's something that's huge. Um, so letting go of control also means letting go of time. It just doesn't work for us to do things in like a clock time frame. So one thing you'll notice is, there's this kind of old saying. It's kind of evolved over the years, but we call it Indian time. And sometimes that means that people show up late, but it's about following what Indian time would be is that relationship with the sun. So there's certain times when that sun is just peeking over the horizon, and at high noon, and just as the sun goes back to sleep. And those are the times that we take to pray. So, like for example, some of you may have gone to sunrise ceremony yesterday. I know there was a few sunrise ceremonies happening across the country. So that time, that sunrise ceremony, that's what Indian time was really about. It was this time that didn't have restrictions that had to do with a clock or minutes or seconds. It was what needed to happen at a certain time would happen, and until that took place, that would be your time and your moment. So I really appreciated those words from John. So with that, I'll move on to the next my next slide. So realities of Indigenous youth today and some of the needs. Again, this isn't to say that all Indigenous youth are suffering or are experiencing these issues, but this is just to give you an insight about what we are facing. And so again, we're always talking about that reconciliation and about residential schools. So the intergenerational impacts of residential schools, the intergenerational impacts of the 60s scoop, those really affect our young people. So they're dealing often with post-traumatic stress disorder, learning disabilities. Many Indigenous youth do have learning disabilities. However, we say they're disabilities, but a lot of the time I believe that they're gifted. And so they don't they might not learn the way Western society wants them to learn, but they learn differently, and that's okay. And that's how our communities accept all peoples, that it's okay if people do things a little bit differently. So a lot of our young people also suffer from depression and lack of confidence. And again, a lot of this has to do with that legacy of residential schools, as well as a long, long legacy of colonial violence. So, what John was talking about, my interpretation of it is we need to get away from assimilation. So forced assimilation is what has brought a lot of these issues onto our young people. Indigenous people being told how they need to be. So that has had a really severe impact on many of us. A lot of our young people, we do live in poverty, and our young people sometimes are not taken seriously. And this is a really big issue, whether it's a young person who is in poverty or is doing well for themselves. This is a constant concern that I've been aware of, and that young people tell me, is that they're not taken seriously. And so that not being taken seriously you can try and try, but if you feel like you're going nowhere, you just walk away. So that's often why young people will step away from different activities that they might have one time been involved in. Um, we are having a hard time reclaiming our culture and traditions. And again, that's that clash of understanding things differently. A lot of the times, just the plain example of time, that's a clash of our cultures and understandings and traditions in this mainstream world. So sometimes it's hard to see how our culture and traditions can fit into this larger mainstream society. It can be very difficult, but I see a lot of young people that continue to try and they continue to maintain their culture and traditions and their languages. So that's a really positive thing that they continue to persist. And always, with all nonprofits, one of the biggest things is a lack of resources and often a lack of opportunities. So again, sometimes young people, we just need someone to take a chance on us. We just need someone to believe in us. Even if we don't have a really stacked resume at the beginning, if someone gives us that opportunity, sometimes that's the step that changes it all. And not feeling empowered kind of relates to all of those. And lastly, one of the biggest concerns I often hear from young people is, and the reason why they avoid certain situations, certain groups of people, certain conversations and dialogues is because there's too much politics. And as Indigenous people, we are political. However, politics should never be something that holds our cultures and our traditions and our languages back. So young people, they'll be discouraged and they'll say, well, there's too much politics. No one's taking me seriously, so I don't want to be involved. So those are some of the realities that I've seen, that I've observed during my work over the last couple of years. I haven't been doing this work as long as John, but just a little bit of my observations over the last couple of years. So you could turn to the next slide now. So evaluations in Indigenous work, these evaluations often have a different meaning than what I think we're hoping it means. So quickly, evaluations often turn into reports. And so as soon as something is called a report, it becomes really daunting. It's like the last thing you want to do. It's that last big, daunting challenge you have to get through. So instead of evaluations being positive, they often turn into this kind of language. Um, and the other part about these reports and evaluations is often they are already predetermined. So they're predetermined by funders before actually talking to the Indigenous youth that are participating, before actually talking to the Indigenous group that might be leading this program. The evaluations and reports are already planned out. And as John was talking about that plan, you can't plan everything. You can have an idea of the good work you want to do, but as soon as you're planning everything down to the last minute, the last dollar, you're going to run into obstacles, especially if you're dealing with our people. That planning and lack of ability to go with the flow really causes tension, and it causes more it causes less understanding. So it also it lets Indigenous youth think that this person doesn't understand where I'm coming from. So that becomes a pretty big issue, and that's something that I hope that funders begin to change, that they begin to have dialogues with the groups that they're funding before they plan out how their evaluations or their reporting is going to look like. Um, and that's nonprofits again, because of the lack of resources that are out there. Nonprofits are often, very reactive. There's not enough time to be proactive. And that can also negatively impact evaluations. So again, from my experience working in nonprofits and Aboriginal nonprofits, my experience has been that evaluations and reporting are always seen as, that that kind of bad thing you have to do at the end of everything, that thing that you don't want to do anymore. Um, and then again, program officers and managers are often not trained properly to look at evaluations. There's also a really big concern when we are developing reports and evaluations that it's just a one-time off program. For quite a number of years, many nonprofit organizations have not been able to carry on good programming. So it's like you just apply for 1 year and then you have to cross your fingers and hope that it will be refunded the next year. So that thinking about reporting and evaluation, it's like, why am I doing this if it's just going to be for this year? But not all programs are like that. There is many programs that have multi-year funding, which is really awesome, and allows those programs to invest more time into evaluation and those reports. And lastly, often those programs and policies that are for Indigenous young people are not actually created or led by Indigenous young people. So this right here also causes another problem. It also doesn't engage young people in the evaluation process. So with all that kind of downer news for you, I hope I'll share some more best practices. So best practices that I've witnessed and best practices that that maybe are just ideas and that maybe you could, as listeners, might be able to build upon. So my number one best practice in terms of evaluation and making it meaningful evaluation is talking circles. So I know we had that poll going out.
Results were that most people are familiar with community involvement and evaluation, and people are aware of talking circles. I think they'd probably like to hear more about how they can be used in evaluation. People are familiar with arts-based approaches. People are least familiar with the idea of including ceremony in evaluation.
Okay, cool. So I'll get into talking circles then. So talking circles can be very formal and very strict, but talking circles can also be informal. However, when you are having a talking circle, you always want there to be a few things that are there, whether they're formal or informal talking circles. So, for example, one thing that's really important is that everybody is in a circle. That circle it really centers us and grounds us. And it also makes sure that we're all at the same level. So the way a talking circle, I would say in a more informal way, will help with evaluation is you can do talking circles at the end of every day if you wanted to. At the end of every week, you could have talking circles with your team, with your staff. You could have talking circles with your youth that are in the program. And you can have really simple talking circles. And it's all about the person who's facilitating. Who's ever facilitating, they will have more of like a lead question. And you will have, you could have a feather, which is more formal. If it's an eagle feather, it's a very sacred item. But some people also use like a talking stick. Some people also use a talking stone. And so these are more informal items, but if you have eagle feather, you know, that's always a really great connection. So that facilitator would start this talking circle with a lead-in question. And it can be really simple. If you have a group of shy youth, you know, it can be really like, say one word about how you're feeling today. And in an informal talking circle, you can also ask the group if they're okay if someone writes down their responses. However, you know, you have to use your judgment if there is things that are coming up that are very personal for someone in the circle. You know, obviously you would refrain from writing that down. So you have to just always be cautious about the information that's being shared, and talk to the group. Let them know that this is your plan. This is how you might want to do a form of evaluation. And the thing about talking circles is it opens people up to different conversations than they might be willing to participate in a one-on-one or in a classroom setting or even in a survey. Talking circles, you build on each other's momentum. You know, that's why we go around in that circle. So everybody has that time to share and that moment to feel like they're heard and listened to. Talking circles have a way of reminding people that we are all on the same level. So even if there's like a program manager and a program assistant and some youth participants in the circle, in that circle, everybody's at the same level. Your job titles, they don't matter in that circle. We're all at that same level. And so people in that circle will talk honestly about their experiences and about what they need for the future. So that's why talking circles would be my number one best practice tool. And just always make sure you do that talking circle with the best intentions, with that open heart and an open mind. So I'll move on to some of my next ones. So making room for ceremony in a meaningful way. As an Indigenous person, as a Métis woman, I really value those ceremonies. So ceremonies for some people could be smudging. I've heard people, you know, say smudging ceremony, and that's great. So sometimes ceremony can also be a drum circle. However, there is more stricter ceremonies that you might not be able to include in a program. But some ways to include meaningful ceremony is to not exploit Indigenous cultures. So a lot of the time, kind of what John was mentioning about, you know, just having, you know, including a drum, but not talking to people about why the drum is so important or why that drum is sacred. And just like that talking circle, you know, not explaining to your participants why these things are important and what their purpose is you're not including those ceremonies in a meaningful way. Another way that you would include ceremony in a meaningful way is by using those medicines. So like I use those 4 medicines: tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. And I always use the best intentions with these medicines. And so if you're looking for honesty in your evaluations, if you're looking for truthfulness, if you're also looking for love and sincerity, you can use these medicines, you know, but you have to mean it. When you offer someone tobacco for their guidance, you have to mean it. If you offer someone, even an elder, some tobacco for a little bit of evaluation or insight into your program or your initiative, you know, you have to pray with that tobacco. You have to mean it, and you have to offer that tobacco with all of your good intentions. So that's about including a little bit of ceremony in a meaningful way. Don't really try to avoid exploiting any of our ceremonies or our sacred items in just to make something look pretty. You know, that's something to be very cautious about. And then what was my second point before that, or my second point after that? I think it was about safer spaces. So, safer spaces will be key to your evaluations if you're looking for truthful evaluations. Many young people, they will either disengage or they will just be silent if they don't feel safe. I've seen it so many times where a young person, they didn't feel safe and someone was kind of, just on them constantly and they just shut down. And then afterwards, when they felt a little bit safer, they would open up about why they did that or how they were feeling. So, again, sometimes we have different ways of doing things. Sometimes Indigenous youth will be silent. And it's not because they don't know what to say or they don't know the answer, but it's because they're really processing it. They're really thinking about what you just asked them. So give them a little bit of time. Give them a little bit of that space. Create that safe environment and let everybody know in your safer spaces that there's no judgment, there's no right or wrong answers, and that they're open to use those medicines. Medicines are often not accepted in some business rooms, for example, or business meeting rooms, and this can create a problem. People are really concerned when we smudge. They're really like, oh no, the fire hydrants are gonna come and the sprinklers are gonna go off, and there's all these concerns. But a lot of us, we need those things in order to feel safe. So just something to take into consideration. And then I think I have I have two last points. So again, always letting young people lead. And even if you think that you might know the better way, you have to let those young people feel heard. And this is also when you do your evaluation process. So ask those young people, just keep asking questions. That's the best way. And have them think about what evaluation might look like to them. Maybe evaluation for them and the outcomes of evaluation are different than what you had originally expected, but that's okay, and keep asking questions, and never think that you know something better than a young person just because of their age. We all learning from each other. Like, even if you're a little baby, a little child, a youth, an adult, an elder, we're all learning from each other, and we have to remember that we're all teachers to each other. Young people, they, like I mentioned in my kind of Debbie Downer slides, but young people are often not taken seriously, and take them seriously. Just listen a little bit. And I think for my last one, my last slide. So that's a little, that last picture was a little bit of kind of showed me about youth leadership and how powerful youth leadership could be. So that was why I chose that picture. Lastly, purpose. Purpose. As Indigenous people and as Indigenous young people, if we don't have a purpose, we don't feel included. We don't feel like we're needed. And so always give young people a purpose, and also allow them to find their own purpose. So finding their own purpose is about them reconnecting to their culture, to their family, to their communities. And that might not always be part of you doing something for a young person, but encouraging them to find their own purpose. And so for me, purpose is about, reconnecting to my roots, finding my spirit name, for example, finding my place in the clan system, for example. Those things gave me purpose, as well as being a drum carrier, as well as learning certain creation stories. Those gave me a purpose. But giving a youth or a young person a purpose in your evaluation or in a program, it can be something so simple. It could be something like what do you think a good question would be to help us find ways to move forward? It could be something just simple like that, you know, and then listen to what they had to tell you. Purpose could also be, you know, allowing a young person to lead a conversation, to lead a talking circle, allowing a young person to be the carrier of a talking stick, or be the caretaker of that talking stone or that feather. That's purpose. And there's so many places that you can include purpose for young people. And purpose is also not about just asking young people to clean up the garbage after the end of a program or a discussion. So that could be part of the purpose, but don't always just make that their purpose. That's really disempowering when that happens sometimes. So those are some of my recommendations, my best practices, and ways that I hope that your evaluation processes can encourage and include young people more.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you to everybody who's still with us. We've now opened the question section of the webinar. We'll be on for 10 more minutes if you have any questions that you'd like answered. Gabrielle, we do have a question for you. The question is, how can ceremony be integrated into evaluation? And they've asked you to clarify.
Okay, so maybe I was having some problems with my audio at that time. So ceremony, like I mentioned, it can be, it really depends who's evaluating the situation, but ceremony can be like as simple as smudging ceremony. So that could be part of your ceremony that you include in evaluation. And again, using it in a meaningful way. So, for example, if you're having a talking circle and you choose that as your method of evaluation, you can have you can smudge, and you can make sure that people know that the reason why we're smudging and we're using that sage is so that we all walk into this with a clear mind and with the best intentions. So that's one example of using ceremony in evaluation processes. Not all ceremony can be used in evaluation process, but for example, if someone is at the end of their program and they need that time to reflect, maybe as an individual or even a group of people, they might approach an elder to have a sweat for them, and they would use this time in that sweat lodge to pray for this program, to pray for that good evaluation and those good next steps to move forward. And then they would bring it back to maybe a group meeting and talk about how they felt after this program. So that might be one way as well.
And John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Gabrielle is right on the money. Miigwech.
Great. We have another question here. Could either John or Gabrielle touch on the importance of grounding approaches to the protocols and the ways of the specific community? So not utilizing pan-Indigenous approaches. So how, maybe said another way, if a Western researcher is engaged in Indigenous evaluation, how can he or she be sure what they're proposing is appropriate? How would one go about determining that?
Do you want to have a go at that one, Gabrielle?
Sure. Okay. So that can be a very tricky one, but you know, if you're talking about reconciliation and you're doing it in a meaningful way, you will take the time to find those people. So those people, they would often be elders, they would be knowledge keepers. And you know, we don't really have like databases of elders, but they're those people that you find, you know, kind of like John was talking about, you know, they just come to you. So you put that out to the universe, like, I need this, I need someone to help me with this. And it might not happen, you might not get a phone call per se or an email right away, but start mingling, go out to community events, look at who's leading those events, look at the people that the young people are respecting and are listening to. Those are usually your people that you need to help with these things. Just get out there in the community, let people know what you're trying to do, and that's how, that's about networking too, right? Like those smoke signals, we really do a lot of things are by word of mouth. And so, you'll talk to one person about your initiative, and then that person will say, oh yeah, you should go talk to this person, and then that person will say, oh well, you should include this person, and that's how it will all happen.
Yeah, if I might add, I think Gabrielle's on the money, and it comes back to that relationship piece and the humility piece that I spoke about earlier. A non-Indigenous researcher going into an Indigenous research context has to first reflect on what they know. And if they don't know anything, and if they've never been schooled in any way, shape, or form around anything Indigenous, then they've got to really come to that conclusion and then embed themselves like a tick in the community at large that research is going to be part of or involved in. The minute that you go in and start thinking that you've got it down, got it down, is the minute you're going to get slapped in the face, metaphorically, and you're going to be humbled. The best thing that a non-Indigenous researcher can do is connect to community in a humble way and literally say to themselves and to that community, I don't know anything, but I'm willing and open to learn. And then be prepared to have your world rocked. Really be prepared for that. Miigwech.
I have another question here, and this is about incorporating the voice of two-spirited folks and two-spirited youth. So do you have any advice on how evaluators and researchers could do that?
I'll defer to Gabrielle on this one as well. Miigwech.
Cool. So this one, I'm not two-spirit myself, but I hope that I am an ally, and I try my best. It's definitely been a learning journey for me as well. In our last program, Reach Up North, we tried our best to have gender equality in the program. However, we thought of gender equality as male and female, and that was our first wrong step. We have to be able to have spaces for all people, and the thing also, researchers and evaluators, they might come into I guess a little bit of controversy with, might be around skirts. So wearing skirts in ceremony is often the elders will tell you if you need to wear a skirt if you're a woman, and but again, it's about having those dialogues, just asking questions, asking those young people, how do you identify? Because I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. It's always about creating those safer spaces. And so ask them, what pronouns do you use? How do you want to identify? Can you tell me a little bit about your story and how it might help my this process that I'm going through? And if you ask those good questions and in a meaningful way, people will open up and they'll start telling you their stories. And also two-spirit, we use that term a lot in Indigenous communities. However, two-spirit doesn't mean that someone is LGBTQ and vice versa, but it could also mean both. So we have to think about, let's not get so concerned about how someone wants to identify, and let's allow them to identify in that way. There's also elders that will tell you those stories about how colonization has deeply impacted our gender roles, and learn those stories. learn those stories before judging anyone. That's really, really important. So yeah, that's what I would say. Just again, it's the same thing. Just be humble about it. You know, go into it without any judgment, and don't try to define anyone.
Thank you for your thoughtful response, Gabrielle. And I think on that note, we will close this webinar. I want to thank everyone who has participated. Miigwech to the presenters, Dr. John Hodson and Gabrielle. And I'd like to invite you all to attend our next webinar, which will be occurring on July the 28th from 11 until 12. And that is on finding and selecting tools for your outcome evaluation. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.